This video is brought to you by MoviePalette.com and enter ROOM15 for 15% off of your palette. Hey everyone, I'm the Blood Guy. Welcome back to another review of a documentary on a serial killer. And for this, we are going back to probably my favorite true crime documentarian, Joe Berlinger, who has done a number of documentaries. The only ones I've actually reviewed would be his Netflix Conversations with the Killer series. I've reviewed all three. Those are probably my favorites. I know of his whole filmography. There's just a lot more that I have to see. But this is another one of his. And there's another one of his on Netflix as this one. Because this is actually a follow-up. I did not know that these two were actually connected. I just thought they had similar titles. But this is from 2021, and it's a serial killer that I was fairly familiar with. Not so much the ins and outs of the investigation. I don't have any books on this killer specifically, but he's in most encyclopedias that I have. These are just two that I pulled. And of course, that is the Torso Killer, not to be confused with the Cleveland Torso Killer of the 1930s, also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. This is the Times Square Torso Killer, also known as the Times Square Killer, Richard Cottingham, who killed at least 17 women between 1967 and 1980 in and around the Times Square, New York area and Bergen County, New Jersey, but has claimed to have killed or committed 80 more perfect murders. And this is all about that. It's part of his Crime Scene series, which his first one was Crime Scene, The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel or Motel. That's one I haven't seen yet, and actually I haven't really heard too many good things about that one. But this is his follow-up. So this is Crime Scene, The Times Square Killer, which came out in 2021. It's 3 episodes. But me and Joe Berlinger, I knew it was going to be very informative, very deep with its research. Probably going to have a lot of photos, a lot of footage from that period. But I was actually kind of surprised because Joe Berlinger usually does quite a deep dive into the serial killer themselves, or killers themselves. And so I was wondering, is this going to be a more investigative piece like Night Stalker or The Ripper, or is this going to be more like his Conversation Tapes series? And I haven't seen his other Crime Scene series, but then again, that one is still unsolved, so you're probably not going to get a lot about that killer. I am familiar with that case. I know it's a pretty famous unsolved case. I just haven't seen that series yet. But so yeah, directed by Joe Berlinger, 3 episodes, the cinematography by Jeff Hutchins, originally released December 29th, 2021. There's really not a whole lot here about the series, so I don't really know how it compares to the Cecil Hotel one, but I really liked this. It's kind of a nice blend of the investigative side, like Night Stalker and The Ripper, and also kind of the deep dive into the serial killer, even though it doesn't really go that deep into Cottingham's life. I mean, it's definitely not the Bundy, Gacy, or Dahmer tapes at all, but it definitely has a lot more about Cottingham than Night Stalker or The Ripper. It looks great. It's beautifully shot, especially the interviews. It is a bit dramatization heavy, which has been kind of hit or miss for me. It's done fine in the Conversation series of his. Here, I thought the dramatization was kind of heavy, though I do like how he made it look kind of gritty, 8mm type. I really did like the music. It has a lot of ominous, dark music throughout. You do have, it is a nice mixture of people that they interview. You have people from New York homicide, New Jersey homicide, various journalists and writers, which there's one guy, Rod Leith, who did write a book on the Torso Killer, which I will be picking up. He's interviewed. The only person in Cottingham's life that is interviewed is this guy named Dominic Volpe that worked with him at Blue Cross Blue Shield, which I was kind of hoping there was going to be someone from his work being interviewed because Cottingham was known to brag about all this dark stuff like meeting with prostitutes and sort of master slave relationships, drugging them, abducting them. Not quite coming out and saying he killed them, but being rough with them. And everyone just kind of blew him off, thought he was a storyteller. So I'm glad they have at least one person from that. Not really family members of the victims are in this. The only one is the daughter, the biological daughter of one of his victims, Dina Godarzi, who her daughter's name is Jennifer Weiss, and Godarzi was part of the double homicide at the Travel Inn where they were decapitated, hands removed, and they were set on fire in the hotel. She was the daughter of one of them. She's interviewed. Of course, it goes into her relationship with Cottingham as far as interviewing and trying to solve the other cold cases. But it's not too much of a deep dive into Cottingham's life, like his childhood or really where all of this started. Not that we would ever really understand him anyway, but we do get a lot of photos of him. We do get some interview footage of him from like 2009. My only complaint about this series is I haven't said it yet. I get why these segments or these topics are in this series, but sometimes I feel like it drags a bit too long or goes a little too deep into it. I mean, it's still fascinating, but I feel like they spent too much time on it, and that is being Times Square, really going into the history of the sleazy side of Times Square, mainly 42nd Street. So there's a lot of, if you think Taxi Driver, New York Ripper, just that 42nd Street strip of porno theaters, peep shows, live sex shows, porno shops, prostitutes. It goes into all that with a lot of archive footage from that as well. So if anyone doesn't know how peep shows or live sex shows worked, you kind of get it through this. And I get that's because that was Cottingham's, mainly his victim profile, at least once we got into the 70s. He started out with young schoolgirls around his age in the late 60s, but he eventually progressed to prostitutes, and this was his hunting ground. So I get why it's there, but it also goes into like the history of these places. Like there's this guy named Marty Hodas who kind of revolutionized that whole strip. He was kind of like Robert De Niro's character in Casino, but for the sex strip of Times Square. How he just revolutionized everything and really brought in the sexual tourism to Times Square. I didn't really feel that was all needed. I get why it's there, but I feel like it had too much of a deep dive into that aspect where I think it could have been used on Cottingham or the investigation. Even though it does go deep into the investigation. I mean, I don't mind that it's there, but I feel like it went too deep. But also the transitions of like going from investigation to the history of the sex industry into a little bit more about Cottingham, and then going to like the history of prostitution in Times Square. The transitions of topics didn't feel as seamless or as fluid as in other Joe Berlinger pieces that I've seen. It's never jarring. Like it's never just like, oh, okay, we're talking about this now. It maybe in a couple instances it was enough to kind of make you notice, maybe take you out of it a bit. but also it felt more scattered, like where it not that it wasn't fluid, but it also felt more scattered and less organized than some other ones that I've seen. But it's still very good. I mean, those are kind of nitpicks. Those aren't really complaints, other than how much time they spend on some of those aspects. I mean, the ones that really made sense to me was really going into like the relationship between prostitutes and law enforcement, really going into how, if a prostitute is attacked and she goes to the police, she'll be arrested for being a prostitute, but the attacker might get a slap on the wrist, might get a summons, but that's about it. And how that kind of gradually shifted. It ties in with the feminism movement of the late 70s. And then it does go into women against pornography, and then pretty much the how both law enforcement and the AIDS epidemic kind of wiped out that whole industry in Times Square, and how it was renovated, kind of like Las Vegas. So a lot of those illicit businesses ended and became more Broadway theaters, more touristy, family touristy. It goes into that at the end, but it does go pretty deep into the investigation, which I find very fascinating. That's why I watch these, as well as the bits going into Cottingham. And Cottingham is mentioned in the first episode, so that's why I was thinking, okay, maybe this is going to be kind of a blend of an investigative procedural and a serial killer documentary. Not quite, but it does have more Cottingham than Night Stalker or The Ripper. But it's still uh, not quite too much of a deep dive, but still very fascinating. Excuse me. As far as Berlinger goes, from what I've seen, this would be at the bottom of his, but it's still very good. I mean, it still looks great. It's shot well. It shot very well. It looks really good. The way all the archive footage and interviews and news articles, the way all that's presented is very well done. A lot of the editing in that aspect is very well done. And then once it finally does get into Cottingham, which we don't even see his mugshot until the police are aware of Cottingham when they're looking into past assaults for survivors, they come across his name, which I've seen that in other documentaries as well. When the police find out, that's when we see who it is. I did think that the guy playing him in the dramatizations looked a little bit like the guy that plays Raider in Mindhunter, which, and yeah, the dramatizations in this are a bit more elaborate or showy or more extensive than past ones. It's not like the Dahmer tapes where you might see a blonde guy with glasses back to at interrogation table but out of focus, or maybe like his chest like up to here talking but out of focus with no audio. This has like full scenes of dramatizations, which again, I'm not the biggest fan of dramatizations. I don't mind it when someone like John Borowski does it, but that's because his films are a bit more artsy anyway, whereas Berlinger is more kind of your straightforward contemporary documentary, which is why I prefer him. So yeah, this one's definitely heavier on dramatizations, but it, it does go deep, and it is very informative with the investigation because, like I said, I knew more about Cottingham and his life and the murders rather than the investigation. So I did find this informative. I would have liked a bit more Cottingham. I would have swapped a bit of the extensive look into the sex industry and prostitution for more Cottingham stuff. But it goes all the way up to present day. I mean, it goes into his further confessions and sort of his quick trials after confessing to and pleading guilty to further murders between 2009 and 2022, which this came out in 20. Actually, it didn't even mention the 2022 one because that happened after the fact. But it ends like the Gacy one, where it says, if you believe a loved one was a victim, please contact with the website. So it's still very good. I might have more complaints for this one than, say, the Conversation series or other ones that I've done. But that's not saying much because they're mostly nitpicks, and it's still a very well-made docuseries. It's only 3 episodes, so I definitely recommend it. Maybe I'll check out the Cecil Hotel one. I haven't really heard too many good things about it, but yeah, I would definitely like him to continue his Conversation series and this crime scene series. I'm guessing maybe this crime scene series is a bit more hotel based because a lot of his final murders, they were found in a hotel. Uh, that was part of the pattern that they were able to put together. So maybe that's going to be the angle for this crime scene series. But I would definitely like to see more. So yeah, I can recommend it. I would just say, as far as Berlinger, it's at the bottom, but that's not saying much because I love all his work. So can recommend it. It's on Netflix. So with that, I guess we'll go into the brief summary, and then I'm sorry, but I did end up taking a lot of notes. So the long segment where I go into what this covers. So as always, I like to give a brief summary on the killer that the film or documentary is based on. The Times Square killer, whose real name was Richard Cottingham, killed at least 17 women between 1967 and 1980, though he claims to have committed, quote, 80 more perfect murders. His other notorious moniker is the Torso Killer, which is not to be confused with the unsolved case in 1930s Cleveland, which is also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. Cottingham would abduct women, usually sex workers, and usually by drugging them at a bar, and then taking them to a hotel, handcuff, rape, torture, and then mutilate his victims. At least 2 of his last known murders, he severed body parts and then set the corpses on fire in the hotel room. He earned the moniker of Torso Killer when the bodies of sex workers Dina Goodartsy and Jane Doe were found headless and handless in a travel-in room in New York City on December 2nd, 1979. He was caught in May 1980 when a maid heard screaming coming from his room at the Quality Inn in New Jersey, and when a young sex worker, Leslie Ann Odell, was forced to answer the door, in which she gave a hand signal that she was in danger, and then police were called. Cottingham was able to thrive in Times Square due to the sex industry atmosphere and the attitude towards sex workers from law enforcement and from the public. Cottingham was known at his work at Blue Cross Blue Shield to talk about his dark desires with sex workers and bragging about his escapades, though no one ever believed him. Though found guilty of several murders between 1982 and 1984, Cottingham would break his long silence in 2009 and start confessing to more murders, both to journalists Nadia Fazzani and Jennifer Weiss, the biological daughter of Dina Goodartsy. Between 2010 and 2022, he has pled guilty to 12 more murders. He is still alive and serving his multiple life sentences in Trenton, New Jersey. And so we'll go over what the docuseries covers. And I thought with 3 episodes I would be able to take less notes, but no, it's Joe Berlinger, so of course everything is interesting and fascinating and full of information. So this is probably going to be just as long as the other ones, so I apologize for that. But episode 1 is called Murder on 42nd Street. It goes into the sleaziness of Times Square in the 1970s. Again, think Taxi Driver, because that's pretty much the atmosphere that we get throughout pretty much this whole series. Then we go to December 2nd, 1979, around 9:30 a.m., a fire on the 4th floor of the Travel Inn Hotel on 42nd Street. Cops and firemen rush up. They rush up to the room. They make out 2 bodies on the twin beds. A fireman goes to attempt CPR and realizes that there's no head. So, unable to see through the smoke, they realize that there were no hands and no head. No hands, no heads. And this is told by Jim Rigel, who's a retired NYPD a detective. We get footage of the hotel and emergency personnel. There's also dramatizations uh, made to look like a gritty 8 millimeter type film. Uh, but then we're also introduced to Malcolm Ryman, who's a retired NYPD homicide detective, and Vernon, excuse me, Vernon Geberth, if I pronounce that correctly, who's retired NYPD homicide commander. And Geberth is kind of our voice throughout this whole series. I mean, we do get some from, I believe it's Jim Riegel as well, but Geberth really sort of walks us through the investigative side of this series. Uh, they go into detail about this, how there was no way to ID the victims, no head, no hands. We get news footage and interviews from locals, how the person registered to that room and had been there since November 29th under the name Carl Wilson from New Jersey, and no one ever saw him other than uh, putting his name in the registry. There was no witnesses except for the woman behind him in line during the registry who gave a description, so they have a composite sketch. We get the sketch, we see the press conference footage releasing the sketch, how he was white, 35, 5'10", around 175 pounds, brown, blow-dried hair. And then it goes into how crowded and full Times Square is, just how full of people, the crime rate of New York in the 70s, making it near impossible to catch a killer. Josh Allen Friedman, who's an author of Tales of Times Square, on the definition of Times Square. To him, he goes over the 13-block square of what makes up Times Square, which is 42nd Street, which is the sleaziest of the streets. Again, think Taxi Driver, like the porno theaters, peep shows, which this goes into depth with. So Taxi Driver and New York Ripper. Think films like that. It goes into what was in Times Square, such as the theaters, the kinds of businesses, the subways, all kinds of people, the foot traffic. Then we go to December 11th, 79, 9 days after the murders. No one's come forward about the victims or the sketch. Only evidence is the clothing that was left behind, stacked neatly in the bathtub. So they had a press conference with the clothes on mannequins to see if anyone comes forward. The photos were all over the city. And then finally, a tip from a woman named Rose saying, "Those are my friend's clothes. That's what she left the house in." And so that her friend's name was Dita Goodarzi. Excuse me. Dita Goodarzi. I'm already stuttering. Is ID'd as one of the victims. The other one was a Jane Doe, still is a Jane Doe. News audio of this in the process of how they ID'd her. Then we're introduced to a woman named Jennifer Weiss, who's the biological daughter of Goodarzi. She goes into how she was put up for adoption, a little bit of her mother's history and backstory, such as how she wanted to find her birth mother, and this was how she found out. She called the adoption agency, and I think they gave her these news articles about the murders, and that's how she found out. It goes into her mother's life, born in Iran, came to America, school in Brooklyn, became a sex worker. Then we're introduced to Dr. Peter Vronsky, which anyone who's into true crime knows Dr. Peter Vronsky. He's written a ton of books. I actually have a few by him. He goes into on how the other victim is still a Jane Doe, but believed to be a prostitute. It goes into the prostitution in Times Square, the term sex worker, how it came out of the stigma of prostitution in Times Square. The sex trade of the area, 42nd Street. It goes into the sex industry of 42nd Street. Porno theaters, bookshops, clubs, dancers, burlesque clubs, even sidewalk barkers for these porno shows, prostitutes. And this is part of the series where I thought it went a little too deep into this subject. I get why it's there. It was such a huge part of Times Square. But it goes into this guy named Marty Hodis. Uh, his daughter is one of the interviewees in this series, and he's known as the porn king. He's the one that like revolutionized the whole sex and porn industry in Times Square during the 70s. Starting with like book and magazine shops to like dance strip joints to live peep shows to live sex shows. He revolutionized the whole thing. And I think it does go in how he was kind of public enemy number one for doing all that. I think it spends a little too much time on all of this stuff, but again, because of who Cottingham was, this was his hunting ground, and these were his victims. And how he was able to get away with it for so long. I get why it's there, but I even put whole segment goes on a bit too long. You get plenty of archive footage of all these kinds of establishments. How some of these places were mob run, like the Gambino family had their hands in it, and how these places attracted predators and men that wanted to harm women. So January 1980, 1 month after the murders, mentions how profiling was kind of new, but they landed on the label of a psychopathic sexual sadist. It goes into that, what that is, what that entails. It goes into detail of all the wounds both victims had, all the different cuts and slices. Godarzi stabbed through the back and into the lung. Cuts all down their bodies, which they would later find out that the cuts all along down their entire bodies. That was him just eliciting fear in them. That's kind of what he got off on, which we will get interview footage where he talks about that. How they were raped and tortured for the 3 days at that hotel. They were introduced to a guy named Dominic Volpe, who he was a former co-worker with the Cottingham at Blue Cross Blue Shield as a computer operator. And this was when I kind of realized, okay, maybe this is going to be both investigative and a deep dive into a serial killer. Sort of a mixture of like the Conversation series by Berlinger and something like Night Stalker or The Ripper, where that's all investigative and this is all serial killer. This is where I thought was kind of going to be both. It doesn't really go that deep into Cottingham, but it does a little bit. The more so than, say, The Ripper or Night Stalker. But we're introduced to him, and he talks about working with Cottingham at Blue Cross Blue Shield back then, how he worked with this guy named Richie Cottingham, who would brag about prowling the night, pick up prostitutes. He would leave work to go do all this XXX stuff, and could tell you where all the good hookers were. He said he was like the sex industry tour guide. May 15th, 1980, 5 months later, there's another fire at the Hotel Seville. A mutilated woman was found. We get dramatization of the crime scene. She was naked, raped, beaten, and strangled to death. Head and hands not taken, but her breasts were severed and put on the headboard. That's when they knew that the killer was toying with them, and it was more about shock value and this tableau. But they were able to run her fingerprints, and she was ID'd as Jean Ann Rayner, a prostitute with a record. Peter Bronsky on how she was a sex worker to gain money for some sort of, I believe it was like a custody suit for her young son. And that's all that was known about her. No one really had any other information on her. And then it ends with Commander Geberth saying that now we have a serial killer. And Volpe on when Cottingham almost vaguely confessed to it. He said their boss slammed the newspaper down. It was like, what kind of sick bastard does this? And Cottingham just said, well, could be you, could be me. Because he was that kind of arrogant, braggy type guy as well. So that's how that one ends. Then episode 2 is called The Perfect Hunting Ground. And it opens with a woman named Barbara Amaya. She tells the story of how she was a Times Square prostitute for 13 years. Men everywhere, and when they buy you, they think they can do whatever they want with you. And how one didn't drive the way she wanted, drove her down by the river, raped and robbed her, made her get out of the car and turn around. She waited to hear the bang, but he never did, and he drove off. And she swears that she was in the car with a serial killer then, and didn't know why she was spared. So we go to May 16th, 1980, 5 months after the murders, and 1 day after Gene Rader. We get the news coverage, news articles, audio and video, how the crimes were now being dubbed the torso killings. Vronsky on the so-called golden age of serial murder, which is between 1970 and 2000. And we get quick glimpses and captions of Manson in 69, Gacy, Bundy, and Hillside Strangler in 78. It says Hillside Strangler, singular, and only Angelo Buono. We only get like a snippet of Angelo Buono. No Kenneth Bianchi. So, but also Ramirez in 85 and Dahmer in 91. And how 82% of serial killers emerged from that 30-year period. And how this was just 2 years after the conviction of David Berkowitz in the Son of Sam killings. Also in New York City, we get news footage of that. And actually, the Sons of Sam Descent into Darkness was my last review. So going right from Son of Sam to this, it kind of a New York City continuation. And actually, one of his victims was named Carr as well. So I've heard the name Carr quite a bit lately. And now there's another one. So now the task force started. Geberth on how serial killers tend to dispose of bodies as not to be noticed, but this guy is flaunting it with shock value and tableaus, as if to say, I'm smarter than you. You know, try all you want, but I'm way smarter than you. And so this can make him a malignant narcissist. It goes into the fear among sex workers and how they had to look out for each other. You know, they would all watch each other get into cars, get plate numbers, sort of pass off things like pepper spray or weapons to each other. And there was one woman, Chatovo, some doctor, I meant to put her name, but I forgot it. She's kind of like a sex industry historian. She's kind of our guide throughout all stuff like this, dealing with sex workers, the sex industry, life on the streets. So she kind of talks us through all that. The investigation looking at Johns and how Times Square was his zone, because it does talk about serial killers and their sort of jurisdictional zones. How they did prostitution sweeps, and then we go back to Barbara Amaya on being approached and recognizing the sketch, but lying out of fear of her pimp, because the prostitutes were seen talking to cops. The pimp's fear that they could get in trouble, or women themselves could be arrested, that they're out of money. And of course, an angry pimp is never a good thing. So, out of fear, she lied. It goes into the not good relationship between cops and prostitutes, which it does that a few times. It keeps cutting back to, you know, how cops didn't respect prostitutes, how prostitutes felt they could never go to the police with rape charges or anything because their story wasn't believed, or they would also be arrested and get a worse charge than their attacker. So it goes into that several different segments with old news footage and interviews with prostitutes. Then we go to the early 1900s with a portion of the history of prostitution in Times Square, with the entertainment industry, where chorus girls would become prostitutes if they couldn't make it in entertainment. And then how the 1970s made icons out of pimps with characters in blaxploitation films. Barbara Amaya on being 12, 12 and a half, when her pimp Moses brought her to New York City and she became a prostitute. And the growing dangers of prostitution. So that whole section goes into that. Investigators looking into arrest records for assault on prostitutes came across a man in two cases, 1973 and 74, attempted kidnapping, assault, robbery, and how the robbery was costume jewelry, not expensive. So it was more about taking a trophy than it was taking something of value. And how one of the cases was actually filed by the girl's pimps, and how the man in those cases was Richard Cottingham. Come on. And then this is when it finally shows a photo of Cottingham. He's been talked about by Volpe, so now he's being shown, and it's his mugshot from that time. I believe it was his. It wasn't the mugshot from his initial arrest on May 22nd. It was in May. I think it was May 28th was that mugshot. The one with just his mustache and no glasses. So then it goes into Cottingham a little bit. Average guy living in Lodi, New Jersey. Worked as an operator at Blue Cross Blue Shield. He had a wife, daughter, 2 sons. And then how in 1973-74, when he was brought to court, the women did not show up to the hearing, so the charges were dismissed. And now in 1980, he's being looked at again, but he doesn't fit the profile. So then Vronsky on his background, how he came from a stable family, atypical of serial killers, good relationship with his mother, excelled at work, did fit the profile. How if killers moved around, they were harder to track, especially out of state. Since back then, departments didn't communicate with each other, so departments in New York had no idea what was going on in Jersey. Then we jump back 2 weeks earlier, May 5th, 1980, at the Quality Inn Motel in New Jersey, room 132, a naked woman was found dead under the bed, handcuffs behind her back. She was found by a maid. Adhesive found around her mouth, circular cuts on her breasts, and the cause of death being listed as manual strangulation. She was ID'd as Valerie Street, and who was a prostitute with a record in Miami. But there was a latent print found on the cuffs, on the ratchet of the handcuffs, but there was no match. At least not in the New Jersey system. If it was the New York department, they would have those early 70s arrests of Cottingham, and they'd be able to match that print. But one detective links the case to the December 16th, 77 murder of nurse Marianne Carr at the same hotel. Her body was found in the parking lot, and how these murders were not connected to the torso killer in New York. So then, once again, it goes into the rise of the live sex shows and the different kind of perverts and predators that would go there. There was one guy, I didn't get his name, but he was a performer at these shows. He's interviewed. He would talk about how he would do these shows with his wife, and one guy even tried to get handsy with her off stage because he paid for the show. He could do whatever he wants with her. So then Volpe on Cottingham telling him about the master-slave shows that he would go to, and the pain being delivered to the women in the show turned him on. Then it goes into the Office of Midtown Enforcement and what that is, or was. And that was pretty much this group of, I think it said like 14 guys and like 432,000 federal dollars put together to really crack down on the prostitution and the sexually explicit uh, establishments. But it also mentions how like 5,000 cops were laid off in the 1970s and crime went up. Uh, we get footage of Mayor Abe Beame and his assistant Cindy Baumgarten on this, like the press conference where they talk about this new group, uh, which included 14 officials and cost 432,000 federal dollars. And Cindy Baumgarten is interviewed in this as well. And again, watching this right after the Son of Sam one, press conference footage with Abe Beame was in that as well. Baumgarten on finding 450 illicit establishments just in Times Square. Uh, how these places were illegal and how they stopped them. You know, they would do things like they would steal power, but when they turned the power off, they would just light candles. But then they would have to get them for not having like an open flame permit. So pretty much just this escalation of stopping them, but how they kept finding ways around it. We get news footage of that. And then Volpe on how Cottingham would brag about bringing girls to the Quality Inn in New Jersey, drug them, and then leave them naked and broke. But they all took his stories as BS at work. They just thought he was just this sort of arrogant, cocky storyteller. It goes into how his wife found out about his activities, not murder, but prostitutes, and filed for divorce. May 22nd, 1980, 18 days since Valerie Street's murder in Jersey, 7 days since Jean Rayner in New York. Now, 19-year-old Leslie Ann Odell is picked up. She was a runaway, made a sex worker. She was picked up by Cottingham. He acts like he's going to rescue her from her pimp, but takes her to the Quality Inn because I told her I want to have sex with you first. So brought her there, handcuffed her. Then she was beaten, tortured, and raped for hours. We get kind of a dramatization of this. He took the cuffs off, points a gun at her. She manages to get the gun, but it clicks because it's a fake gun, and that's when he comes at her with a knife. But that's a maid, hears the screams, knocks on the door. He forces her to answer it to tell her everything's fine, but she gives some sort of hand signal, and that's how that episode ends. So episode 3 is called End of an Era. It opens with Rod Leath, a reporter for The Record, and he's also the author of the book of The Torso Killer, which is on my list to get. On the call coming in of an incident at the Quality Inn, how he went to it because that was his area to report on. And then it recaps that last story with Leslie and Odell. So the maid calls the cops. He hears the cops. He tries to flee. They stop him in the hallway. He drops everything he has, which includes cuffs, a bottle of sedatives, bondage restraints, all kinds of stuff. And how Leslie Ann Odell was interviewed by police, and he's arrested. And then we get the photo of his initial May 22nd, 1980 mugshot. And now the police know, even further have a connection of Richard Cottingham, and they try to build their case. So then, May 23rd, 1980, New York City, 1 day after arrest, 5 months after the double homicide, and 8 days after Rayner. They have no suspects and no idea that a similar MO suspect has been arrested in Jersey. So we go to Bergen County, New Jersey. Photo of him being brought into the station. Prime suspect in the 2 Quality Inn murders. Peter Vronsky on how Carr had been abducted from the same complex where Cottingham lived just 5 years prior. And then all the similarities in the cases. How Bergen County looked into unsolved rape and assault cases for survivors to question. And so then that's when we get these bits on the survivors, such as March 22nd, 78, survivor number 1 was Karen Schilt. I believe it's the same voice actress for all three of them. It does say taken from official documents, but I believe it's just a transcript. I believe it's the same voice actor for all three survivors. But we get audio of the account, how she woke up naked in a sewer of the complex. Then Gebert on the account as well, how she came into contact with Cottingham at a bar in New York City. He drugged her, took her to Jersey. She was beaten, sexually assaulted, and then her breasts were severely bitten, and audio of him telling her, "I used to live here." October 12th, 1978, victim number 2 was Susan Geiger. Audio saying how when she woke up, her jewelry was gone. And then Ryman on how she came into contact with him. She was approached by him in Manhattan. She was a sex worker. She said she was too busy but agreed to meet him the following night. They both showed up. He drugged her at a bar, took her to New Jersey. Similar injuries. And then May 12th, 1980, Pamela Weisenfeld, who was victim number 3. Get audio of how she woke up in a parking lot with no memory. Gebert on how he picked her up the night before. She was a sex worker. Her audio of how he kept waving wads of cash at her, like $3,000. Took her out for drinks. He kept groping her and was rough. And then it goes into how she was drugged, taken to New Jersey, and then later reported her beating and sexual assault. And it goes into the connections of all these cases, such as being picked up near Blue Cross Blue Shield. Schilt was found in the parking lot of Carr's apartment, which was Cottingham's former apartment. Weisenfeld was days before Leslie and Odell. All were drugged, and Cottingham was found with sedatives. Goes into how they wanted the woman to come out and help them, but that was proving difficult. Because then it goes into, again, with that Dr. Chadavo, I believe her name was, how in the 1970s, rape victims were not well treated, especially if they were sex workers. They were often arrested, and Johns were not. Then it goes into the rise of the feminist movement with footage of different marches. How laws changed, so now Johns would get misdemeanors and get printed. So then, it was more safer for prostitutes and women in general to come forward with these cases. So now as victims came forward, we get a photo of the lineup, and it goes into how he shaved his mustache to look different. So he kind of pulled a Bundy. But all three survivors were able to ID him. Cottingham is written about in the news as a suspect in New Jersey. New York takes notice, sees the similarities, and now those two departments are now working together. They get a search warrant, and in the basement they find all kinds of pornographic and S&M material, women's clothes and purses, and then there's a lockbox with objects belonging to the victims, such as Jean Ann Rayner's necklace that she's actually wearing in a mugshot, the key to Marianne Carr's apartment, and then a little koala bear pendant belonging to one of them. But having Jean Ann Rayner's necklace, that links him to the New York cases. So the news report on Cottingham being a suspect, Volpe on being questioned by police, and giving them a diagram that Cottingham had drawn him, that he saved. He said he doesn't know why. A diagram, I believe it was where all the good hookers were. Gives that to police and how he wanted to help in any way he could. Vronsky on the long list of charges. We're introduced to Donald Conway, who is his defense attorney, known as the best defense attorney in New Jersey, on how he took the case and how his mother defended him very vehemently, and how Cottingham was very adamant about his innocence and insisted on going to trial. So then it's broken up into trials. Trial number one was for Valerie Street, Susan Geiger, Karen Schilt, and Weisenfeld, and Pamela Weisenfeld, and Leslie Ann Odell. Vronsky on how this was the first murder trial that he knows of where signature evidence was used. So not just the physical evidence, but the fact that the signature was the same in all of them. And how the prosecutor said that abduction, handcuffing, taping around the mouth, and the mutilation, such as cutting along down the bodies to enlist fear or instill fear, that was the signature that was the same in all of them. So the signature is the same, but the MO is different. So he killed via stabbing, strangulation, etc. MO is different, same signature. And that's the first time that signature was used as evidence. I found that fascinating. So then we get audio of Schiltz, Odell's, and Geiger's testimony. It goes into the forensic evidence. And then we actually get audio from Cottingham himself. And it actually says actual audio from Cottingham on how police are corrupt and plant evidence, how he was part of the nightlife, not a good husband, how hookers will lie and tell police what they want to hear, and how he was at work during all those hours. And then Volpe on testifying against him and actually showing them how he cheated the time clock at work. He's found guilty. So September 28th, 1982, trial 2, the one for Marianne Carr, he's found guilty. That's pretty much all it says about trial 2. May 31st, 84, trial 3, which is for Godarzi, Jane Doe, and Jean Ann Rayner. We go back to Jennifer Weiss, Godarzi's daughter, on how the pimp, or a pimp, I can't remember which one, actually beat up Cottingham in the hallway at the courthouse. But then how he was sentenced to almost 200 years, and then Gebert on going to see him in Trenton in 1984 to ID the Jane Doe. He said he was arrogant, cocky, smiled at him, and would not give an ID. So then Vronsky on how he sat silently in prison until 2009. So then we jump to 2009. Footage of Cottingham in prison in 2009, meeting with journalist Nadia Fetzani, who appears in the series as well. And she talks about meeting him, how she's a journalist for the psychology of serial killers. And she was hoping he would give some insight, but not come right out and confess to a whole bunch of stuff. But we do get footage of that interview with him confessing to her, saying it was all the psychological aspect that he enjoyed. Knowing that he could do whatever he wanted to them because they were afraid. But how he also killed to protect himself. Like if he felt they were going to go to the police, he would kill them. Also goes into how he admitted to the travel-in murders. Goes into detail about that. Such as even carrying their heads in a bag, being stopped by police and saying, "Oh, I'm just going to get something to eat." Throwing the bag in his trunk and then going back to set the room on fire. Admits he has no remorse, admits he has remorse, but he makes it sound like he's more remorseful that he got caught. And says that he committed another 80 perfect murders that they don't know about, which altogether, that's 85 to 100 murders. Which, according to the journalist, she said that he told her that he had a victim every other week for 13 years, and how Times Square and the atmosphere encouraged and helped him get away with killing. It goes into, with footage, the Women Against Pornography, the cleanup of Times Square, how law crackdown closed all these places down, but also how the AIDS epidemic kind of wiped out the sex industry, and a lot of these places closed down because of AIDS. The closing of many or all of these establishments, how crime decreased, and then the renovation of Times Square, including the I can't remember the name of the theater, but it was a very historical theater opened up in 1903 that became a sex theater. It was being torn down, but then Disney and New York City bought it, turned it into a live theater, which was the first time that the Lion King Broadway premiered. I thought that was interesting. Uh, so then we go back to Jennifer Weiss, who says that there's all these cold cases. What if he did kill up to 100 women? She wanted to solve these cases, so how she started meeting with Cottingham, starting a relationship with him as far as trying to get details and names from him. She does say, "We are not friends." She's very adamant about that. She just wants to help solve these cold cases. And how in 2010, he confessed to the 1967 murder of Nancy Vogel. We get audio of him pleading guilty to that. And how he confessed to 5 other murders in Bergen County, going as far back as 1968, with names, photos, and dates. How they were all teens, not sex workers. So how it was kind of a gradual thing. Like he started with these teens, which he was much younger than too. I think he was 20 when he first started killing, though he says he was also a teen. But how he progressed to killing prostitutes eventually. But so how those murders were never linked to him because the profile was different. And so then Weiss on continuing her relationship with Cottingham because she wants the names and to give them justice. And then similar to the John Wayne Gacy tapes, it ends with text saying, if you believe that a missing loved one is a victim of Richard Cottingham, please contact NYPD Crime Stoppers, and then it gives a link at crimestoppers.nypdonline.org. Okay, so that is Crime Scene, the Times Square Killer. As far as Berlinger goes, the ones I've seen by Berlinger, I might actually put this one at the bottom. There are other ones I need to see. I'm very aware of his whole filmography. I just haven't seen all of them. But I didn't really find it anywhere near as good as his Conversation series. I do appreciate trying to blend the investigation and the dive into Cottingham. I do believe that if they were going to do that, they could have made it more equal. Again, I do get the necessity, or not necessity, the reason and the relevance for, having these segments on the prostitute industry, the sex and pornography industry, and everything like that in Times Square, because that was the atmosphere, and it was such a huge role in Cottingham and his crimes. But sometimes I feel like it dragged on, and it was so scattered throughout the series that they'd be talking about the investigation, and then they jump right into that. It kind of pulled me out of it a little bit. I mean, I guess it makes sense where all those segments were placed, but it didn't quite feel as seamless as other transitions I've seen in other crime docs. But it's still very well edited, still very well put together. I mean, it looks great. I'm not the biggest fan of dramatizations, but it didn't feel as extensive as other ones that I've seen. It was a little more extensive than his Conversation series. But the interviews are all shot very well. The audio is very well done. It does have plenty of archive and news footage and audio. It's still very well put together. Joe Berlinger, probably my favorite true crime a documentarian. And even though I might put this at the bottom so far, I've heard that the Cecil Hotel one actually is not that good. Maybe I'll check that one out at some point. But so far, the ones I've seen, this one's at the bottom, but it's still pretty good. It's still definitely well worth the watch. I kind of already knew everything about Cottingham that this covers, but a lot of stuff more on the investigative side I didn't really know. So it was still, I still found it illuminating. still very, very interesting. So it's still very well worth the watch. The only thing is, I will say that everything involving the prostitution and sex industry segments tended to drag on a little too long. I would have rather it had been either deeper into the investigation or on Cottingham himself. But I do appreciate it having more about Cottingham than some other series I've seen, like Night Stalker or The Ripper, even though I really like those series as well. So there's a few more on Netflix that I'll be checking out and getting to. Uh, uh, I'll check out some of the other streaming services I have, and I still have some docs and movies to get to that I've been to get to for a while. So not sure which one I'll do next, and I might redo with this format the Confession Killer one, but that's 5 episodes, so I can only imagine how long that'll be. But anyway, not sure what'll be next, but stay tuned for whatever it is, and thank you for watching.